Alright, so let's talk about some skull anatomy. Got two skulls here. I've got my plastic human skull, courtesy of Somso, quality maker of anatomical models, and my actual human skull, courtesy of some dead guy. Right now you're wondering why I have a human skull in my house, and I'm wondering why you don't. So, let's start with the major bones of the skull. Now, when we look at these bones, you can see the borders of each bone where they're jointed together there. These are called sutures. They're a little more prominent on the actual skull here. So there's our sutures. Now, this particular suture is called the coronal suture. Corona is crown, so we have this suture. This suture is the sagittal suture. It's along the sagittal plane. Suture on the back of the head is the lambdoidal suture. It looks like the Greek letter lambda. And the suture here on the side of the skull, there, is the squamous suture. Now again, we can see these bones and their borders based on those sutures. This bone in the front of the skull here makes up your forehead. It's called the frontal bone. If I take that bone out of the skull, it looks like this. The frontal bone, like so. Top of your eye sockets in your forehead. You see this hollow cavity on the frontal bone there. The nasal bones will articulate here. This cavity, that hollow space there, is the frontal sinus. A sinus is a hollow place in the bone that you can't access unless we take the skull apart. So you'll never be able to see a sinus cavity unless the skull is disarticulated. So there's the frontal bone there in the front. The bones here on the side of the top of the skull, one on either side. Those are parietal bones. Separately, the parietal bone looks like that. Not a whole lot of feature to it. It's just a flat bone. All right. On the back of the head there, big hole in it, we have the occipital bone. Separately, like so. Now, that big hole in the occipital bone is where the brain meets the spinal cord. It's called the foramen magnum, which means big hole, which is convenient because that's what it is. These two smooth places, there and there, those are occipital condyles, and that's the joint between your head and your neck. That's where your head meets your neck. Now that little hole right there, or right there, that is the hypoglossal canal. It's where the hypoglossal nerve leaves the brainstem and runs up to the roof of the mouth, where it goes to the tongue. Hypoglossal canal. We can see those. So that's your foramen magnum. Hypoglossal canal is a little harder to see on this model because the skull's still put together. There. And of course your two occipital condyles. All right. So now, let's pick another bone. All right. Side of the head there. That is a temporal bone. If I take it out of the skull, it looks like that. So here's a temporal bone. Now this very flat, thin region up here, it looks like a big fish scale. That's the squamous region. Means scale-like. Back here, this sort of bulky region back here is the petrous region. Like a rock. Petrous region, all of this. The squamous region doesn't have a whole lot of feature to it. It's just this thin, the flat part. You do have this little ribbon of bone that sticks out to the side. This is the zygomatic process. It's called the zygomatic process because it will touch another bone. This bone, the zygomatic bone. So, zygomatic process. Now, just behind the zygomatic process is this very nice little smooth round place right here. You can see it on the skull right there where the jaw articulates, right behind the zygomatic process. Here. That is the mandibular fossa. A fossa is a smooth place. It's an indentation, often for a joint, but doesn't have to be. It's just an indentation in the bone. A foramen is always a hole. A fossa, not a hole, but an indentation. So there's the mandibular fossa. Right behind the mandibular fossa is the external auditory meatus. A meatus is a hole that doesn't go all the way through. And you can see this. So the external auditory meatus is the outside ear hole. Just behind that external auditory meatus is this big round projection. You can feel this on your own head. Right behind your ear, there's that protrusion of bone. That is the mastoid process. On the underside of this bone, there's this sharp little pointed projection. That is the styloid process of the temporal bone. And if you look between the mastoid process here and the styloid process here, there's a little hole right there. That is the stylomastoid foramen. On the inside of your head here, you'll see that there is another hole that doesn't go all the way through. That is the internal auditory meatus. And then there is a hole that goes all the way through, right there. We can see through it. That is the Carotid Canal. So, again, temporal bone, squamous region, petrous region, zygomatic process, mandibular fossa, external auditory meatus, mastoid process, styloid process, stylomastoid foramen, internal auditory meatus, carotid canal, temporal bone. All right. In front of the temporal bone, right here, is the zygomatic bone. And you can see it makes up part of the eye socket here. The zygomatic bone. zygomatic bone. Dislocated this jaw. There we go. So features you need on the zygomatic bone. This region, that is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. Because, just like the zygomatic process of the temporal bone was named because it touches the zygomatic bone, the temporal process of the zygomatic bone is named because it touches the temporal bone. So, temporal process, it's a little pointy part right there of the zygomatic bone. This sort of surface where your eyes makes a part of your eye socket. This is the orbital surface. The orbit's the eye socket. So there's their orbital surface. Zygomatic bone. Temporal process. Orbital surface. All right. So since it's going to fall off anyway, the mandible, the jaw. So features of the mandible. That little wavy line right there. That's called the alveolar margin. Sometimes called the alveolar process. It's this wavy border created where the teeth are socketed in. The body of the mandible, right here in the middle. You can think of it as sort of your chin. This is all the body of the mandible. And the body turns around here, and we have this flat region right there. That flat region is called the ramus, where the body makes this corner here and turns up into the ramus. That is the angle of the jaw, the angle of the mandible right there. So we have two projections up here. We have a condyle. Condyle means a knuckle. It's always going to be a smooth projection for a joint. Earlier, we looked at the occipital condyles. This is the condyle for the mandible, the mandibular condyle. And then we have the coronoid process. Coronoid means beak-like. So that's the sharp one there. Now there are some holes on this bone, but we're not gonna, if you're curious, mandibular foramen, mental foramen, but I won't ask you those on the exam. Mandible. All right, moving right along. So you have other bones with teeth in them here. These are the maxillary bones. And just like the mandible, there is an alveolar margin on the maxillary bone. Now, maxillary bone, alveolar margin. The roof of your mouth, for the most part, here, the Palatine Process. Now, I will warn you, that's the Palatine Process, not the Palestine Process or the Palpatine Process. Palestine is a place. Palpatine is the Emperor in Star Wars. I've gotten both those answers, and I continually make fun of them over the years. It's called that because there's another bone that sits right here, the Palatine Bone, which we'll look at momentarily. This, the part that sticks up there, it's going to touch the frontal bone, so that's the frontal process. this big hollow space in the maxillary bone is the maxillary sinus. It is a big hollow cavity in the bone. Maxillary sinus. Well, it won't be on your exam, and you can double check this versus your list of terms. That is the infraorbital foramen, but again, it's not on your list, so I won't ask that of you. So, maxillary bone. All right. Maxillary. That always works. Yeah, there we go. All right, so let's look down on the skull. All right, so the bone that we're looking at right here is the sphenoid bone. So features of the sphenoid bone. And looking at my box of disarticulated skull bones, I'm without a sphenoid bone that's disarticulated. So we're just going to have to look at this in the intact skull. Here are the greater wings of the sphenoid bone. The lesser wings are up here. In the middle, the structure is called the sella turcica. There are two holes right here on either side of that are going to lead out to the eyes. Those are the optic canals, optic foramen sometimes. Just below that, you see that big elongated hole right here. That is the superior orbital fissure. The round hole just under that superior orbital fissure, the perfect circle, is called the foramen rotundum, which means round hole. The oval-shaped hole right there that we're looking at, that is the foramen ovale. And that little bitty tiny hole right there is the foramen spinosum. So, optic canal, those two in the middle, superior orbital fissure, foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, foramen spinosum. This big hole right there, this weird, let's see if I can position this correctly, that hole right here. This one. That is the foramen lacerum. And the foramen lacerum can only be seen when we put the skull together, like so. It's not a hole in a bone, it's a hole between the sphenoid bone and the temporal bone. Just like this big giant hole right here, that's the jugular foramen. And it's also not a hole in the bone, it's a hole between the occipital bone and the temporal bone. This bone, right here, we can just see the top of it right there, that is the ethmoid bone. And that structure that looks like it has a lot of little bitty holes in it, it does. It's called the cribriform plate. And the olfactory nerve branches out through all those little tiny holes. That little ridge that sticks up right there on the top, that is the crista gali. It means rooster's crest. And that sticks out the top of the ethmoid bone there. Now, because I don't appear to have a disarticulated ethmoid bone either, those will be the only two features that I'm worried about for you on the ethmoid bone. I believe ethmoid sinus was a term that is on your list. You don't need to worry about it because I can't show it to you without our disarticulated ethmoid. That leaves us with some other bones that I can only show you on the articulated skull. Now, while I do have them separately, there's not a whole lot of point in them separately. These include the nasal bones, which are right here on top of the nose. You can see the sutures there. 1, 2 nasal bones. It includes the vomer, this bone that runs down the middle of the nose, the inferior nasal septum here. It includes these bones right there. These are the ridges in the nose. Those are the middle nasal concha. It includes these bones right inside the eye socket. You can see the little hole right there. This tiny little bone right here where my thumb is. The lacrimal bone. The lacrimal bone is named for that little hole right there, and the lacrimal duct, or the tear duct that would sit in that. And then on the roof of the mouth, so there's the Palatine Process of the maxillary bone. These bones back here are the Palatine bones. Also back here is a feature of the Sphenoid bone that I forgot to mention earlier. These projections right here are still part of the Sphenoid bone right here. And these would be called the pterygoid processes. If I had the sphenoid bone separately, sphenoid kind of looks like a little bat, and these kind of look like feet on there. Pterygoid process of the sphenoid bone. Alright, we did already look at sutures. Trying to remember if I've forgotten any bones here. I don't believe so. Now, your exam will be things that are labeled either on photos or diagrams. In a normal situation, I would have skulls labeled for you, but since we're doing this online, you'll have either photos or diagrams. All these features can be found on a real skull, obviously. One thing to notice here is that ethmoid bone, which would sit right there where that giant hole is mostly broken out. In a real skull like that, the ethmoid bone is mostly made up of hollow cavities. And it's really easy to break out if you ever reach in and grab the skull by the eye sockets like that. With enough pressure, those little hollow cavities will just cave in all the way through. And so you'll notice that lots of that structure there is missing. The teeth will fall out because there's that periodontal ligament. There's nothing really holding them in. There are lots of things that we can determine from skull anatomy. You can determine gender of a skeleton. You can determine ethnicity or origin of a skeleton to some degree. There are differences between different ethnic groups and the skull features of those. And if we have time, we'll look at that later. So those are the features of the skull. Consult your list that is on your Blackboard page. Your first lab exam will just be bones of the skull. Your second lab exam will be the remainder of the bones.